Carsten is back.
Yeah. So thank you. It's been a bit of a challenge to make this because constantly Catherine was saying, "Oh, you need to say something about that also." And I also knew that I will overlap quite a bit with what Karen was touching upon and what Sina was touching upon. So I'm trying to navigate being the last in that row, and I'll also address a little bit some of the things we talked about yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about definitions and the importance of definitions, and I made several comments on it. And I think I'll like to stress again that, what is biodiversity? And I really appreciate that both Sina on behalf of the council, but also Danish industry is talking about biodiversity as a term. And what is biodiversity? It's basically all life on Earth in all its forms, from gene, which was lacking for the CBD definition, to species and ecosystems. It's diversity on all levels, but it's also the interaction between it. And why am I repeating what was said yesterday? That's because this is super important. Because in Denmark, at least, we have a long tradition for trying to avoid using the word biodiversity and instead using the word nature. But nature is not very clearly defined. It's not what's it in the treaties and agreement. And nature is much more loosely kind of defined. And I'm going to show you a picture that was taken for social media, and it's about a farmer, and he's very happy, and he's super happy about the diversity that he has in his backyard. And Snorri also made the reply on that this species, lupin on Iceland, there was a lot of people that was really fond of it, but it's also a non-native species. And I cannot say that this person is not right. This is nature. It's nature to him. It's not very clearly defined. This is why I also made the comment that I hope that the new law will be about biodiversity and not nature, because nature can be anything we defined. A long time ago, we had a big issues in Denmark where we converted a lot of non-agricultural field into agricultural field, and the then food minister says nothing has been destroyed, because it was not nature to me. End of discussion. So that's a bit of a problem. I was also in a council that was supposed to highlight the most iconic part of Danish nature. And I was very happy to be there. I thought it was important. The first meeting, we spent 3 hours, discussing whether this species should be on the iconic list for Danish nature, because a lot of people thought that this was nature. And I stepped out of that work. It ended up being very nice. So that's just to reiterate that the definitions are important, and let's stick with biodiversity, because it actually is very clearly defined. It's clearly defined in convention, in agreements, and in scientific literature. Nature is not. Sina talked about this result, and I also show it, that how much have we protected in Denmark. And in the Green Deal, there's a very interesting sentence saying we need to agree upon a definition of what protected areas is, because the government has already reported in we have 30% in ocean and we have 16% on land, so we're basically at the goal. And in the Biodiversity Council, we kind of saying, well, actually, it's less than 2% that really can fulfill these criteria. And I've been saying to the politician, why are we trying to reinvent definitions? Because the EU Commission in the EU biodiversity strategy has issued a very long and detailed report about what can count. It is a very convoluted document, as many of the things from the EU Commission is. So in Danish Biodiversity Council, we try to translate what it means. And I put up these, there's basically 5 criteria for a protected areas. And I should say that we have added one thing, and we're very clear that we added it, that these measurements should contribute, or the areas should contribute to the goal of the EU biodiversity strategy. That basically means that it needs to lead to safeguarding or maintaining biodiversity. So we put that in. But basically, it is legal protection, long-term legal protections. clearly identified conservation values and objectives. We did not have that when we designated Nature 2000 areas in Denmark. We just draw lines on a map, and after that, we tried to come up with reason for why we did it. That we actually are clearly measuring the status and the changes. We have monitoring and we have management. And if we are successful in creating an ecosystem that can manage itself, we don't need a lot of management. But if it doesn't work, and a lot of small areas will need management. These are the 5 criteria that EU, with our interpretation of it, is saying for protected areas. And I hope that countries that that are in the EU will basically get agreement on this. And I think the things for the EU Commission is very sensible and very science-based. Then there's 5 additional ones for strict protected. And that is, it is looking at that areas should have ecological integrity. And that requires larger areas and the ecosystems is functioning, the process and the natural process is functioning. It should also be, you can have areas that is fulfilling all the criteria, but not really important for biodiversity. So in the strict protected, there's also a recommendation that these need to be relevant and have a high potential. And that could be unique areas with few species or areas where there's a lot of species. The natural ecological processes are basically left undisturbed or supported that they function. And only management supporting or increasing natural processes should be allowed. That means that we have lots of management that's nothing to do with nature. And we basically in the strict protected, we can do those in the protected areas, but in strict protected, need to be a focus on the natural processes. And then this is, we heard about that size matters. Area size should support the ecological process. That means in all these tiny, tiny areas, we have so many of in Denmark, they're not supported. So according to this, they can't count in the strictly protected. It needs to be a well-functioning ecosystem. And I don't have time, but what we did in the council, we went through all the different types of protection schemes and we evaluated them, whether they fulfill these criteria. And by the end, we had only 3 that fulfilled them: untouched forest, what we call nature national parks, and then a lot of private foundations have areas also that fulfill them. And most of the other schemes has problems with some of these criteria. And we did the same for the marine. Some of you ask about where is the document. I could not find it online, but this is the name of the document, European Commission, Criteria and Guidance for Protected Areas Designation, Staff Working Document. If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it somewhere, or write me. So what does it require to bending the curve? We can have, and Sina showed this, we can have business as usual. We are in the gray curve. We can increase our conservation effort. It might halt the decline, but that's not enough. Then we can do increasing conservation effort, maybe stop the decline. But if we are to get above, to bend the curve up to the green areas, then just having the target on protected areas is not sufficient. We also need, you kind of pointed to the consumptions. I mean, it's a sustainable use of resources in the world, and this is where the private sector comes into. So basically, if we are to get up here, it's not enough that we designate areas. We need to deal with the way we're using resources on them. So who shall solve the biodiversity crisis? We have governments in countries is often working with protection and protection areas, but we also have the private sector, and that is the consumption and sustainable consumption of this. This is where business comes in. And then we have the citizens and societies. And that could be citizens, acting who they're voting for, or they could be citizens acting on their consumption habits. But these are the 3 things that we need to together get going in order to solve these issues. And I don't think if we remove one of the legs on these 3 leg chairs, it will fall. And this is why private sector is super, super important. I think that a big part of the solution is in the private sector. And we just heard from Karen that they're doing a lot of it. And I don't want to go into detail. We have the EU taxonomy, we have the ESG, we have the CSRD, the financial closure, and they basically work in the steps. They're saying, accept the issues, understand it, try to avoid harming nature unnecessarily, reduce your impact, and adopting what is called nature positive business model. And just as a side remark, I don't like the word nature positive because production cost. It will never be positive. So if we could get rid of that term, that would be really nice. It's about reduction of our impact and then do governmental things to offset the rest. But that's the curve we're on. By the end of the year, this year, all big companies on the stock markets need to report. They need to take their value chains into it. In basically 2 or 3 years, 95% of all companies in Europe will have to report on these things. This is why I asked the question about agriculture. I know the answer, but it's like agriculture has not discovered that they're part of this. So why should, oh God, this is no slide. This is a talk I gave to the Danish fashion and textile industry on the water thing. But it's in general, why should companies be interested in this? We talk about carrot and sticks. This has to do with the license to operate. This is in the self-interest of companies. It's about security of supply. Lots of companies depend on supply that will not just continue forever if we continue business as usual. It's about resource scarcity. It's about increased natural disasters, for example, as a consequence of extreme events caused by climate change. And it's also about the risk of governmental regulation. If I'm a little bit bold, I'll say the EU Commission has told the private sector, if you can figure out to do this in a good manner, we will not come and regulate you. And if there's something private sector likes to do is that we like to define our own terms. So this is actually a push in that direction. This is also why EU has come with this without saying this is how you're going to do it, because that would have taken 10 years. So instead they come out and set the demands and then put the wheels turning saying we need to figure this out. And as you heard from Karen, the Danish industries and globally is very much into this, at least some of the things. And then there's reputational risk. That's back to the consumers. I mean, if you are doing really bad things, what would be the reputational thing? And for example, some years ago, the world fashion industry was almost collapsing because of child labor. So this is something that business take very, very important. And it is important. And there's going to be a huge lack of clean water in the world. So if you, for example, the textile and fashion industry that use enormous amount of clean water, they have a challenge. The same does agriculture. If you look at areas that have high water risk regions, that means that there will not be clean water enough for business to go on as normal, or for health issues for us people, or just to drink. It's about 50% of the global productivity. And I was so thrilled because it's been one of our major points. That is about the value chains. And Karen was saying 80%, and I normally say that 80 to 90% is in the value chains. And most companies has not dealt with that. So it's really thrilled to see that. If you look at construction, about 40% of all the raw material in the world is used in the constructions. And while cities covers a little bit, we are what we consume in cities is enormous. And the way we've been challenging this or taking aboard this deal in Denmark is very much by, we do love flowers, making these flower beds, right? But this is not going to offset the enormous the impact we have on nature. What it's really about is the raw material. Where do we get it from? And where do we get it from in the ocean? Are we destroying areas that's really important? Are we destroying things that are not very important? And this is what we're basically asking companies to start thinking about. And then how are companies to assess these things? There's two types of suggestions out there. One suggestion is that you hire you hire a biologist, a consultancy firm, and you go out and you count 5 Hoover flies, and then you do something and you count 10, and you say, gee, that's a double of the biodiversity things. But that's not really an offsetting of anything. Another approach is to know where your material comes from and start looking at what's the impact in that region. And as Karen said, most of this is about the global. Almost everything we produce in Denmark is depending on we take materials somewhere else, and that's the impact. And the interesting thing, the difference between climate is that kind of stop at the borders. We never count what happens outside. But in biodiversity, it does not stop. And that's a really positive thing with biodiversity. We need to deal with our footprint out there. And there's quite a bit of schemes out there, and one of the best one is the risk filter by WWF. This is what is your risk if you use and pollute a lot of water in terms of reputational risk. And basically the red areas is where you have a high reputational risk. In Bangladesh, they're really faced by being threatened by being thrown out by the government because the public is in lack of clean water. And we have lots of industry there that is polluting water. The challenge with this is that saying, okay, I know I get products from Brazil, but Brazil has the same color all over. And that's not the case. I mean, the impact will vary from place to place tremendously. So while this is some of the best we have, and it's really worth looking at this risk filter because they have all the right things, but the resolution of the information they have is not very useful if you're a company. Just saying, I got it from Brazil, but you can get it from Brazil where you don't do any harm, and you can get it from Brazil where you might do enormous amount of harm. So, so that leads it to how to measure biodiversity. There is a lot of schemes coming on, like the science-based target. It is really good what I've seen. I've seen the two first ones, and they're scientifically really good. They're super complex, and they'll be absolutely impossible for companies to deal with. And I think that a lot of companies have signed up to it. When they start receiving it and saying, this is what you need to do, they will leave it. But hopefully they won't leave it to not do anything. So what are we going to do? And I normally, when I'm out talking to a company, I normally say, it's super easy for me to say all the bad things you shouldn't do. But it's very difficult for me to answer, what should I then do? And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we have in the scientific world where we're doing research on this. We need to simplify it. And yes, we do not have a CO2 equivalent for biodiversity, but we still need to come up with somehow to simplify it. And I'm just going to outline a little bit with what I'm working with people in Oxford. So I presented yesterday that we have this ecological integrity. That's basically space. Some people have said that maybe we use area as a unit. But the problem is that areas is not enough because you can have areas with no value or areas with big values. So we need to add something into it. And this is what I presented yesterday that we did in Biodiversity Council. That's add quality. So it's area and the quality of the area. That's ecological integrity. But we need something else. We need ecosystem intactness because we can go from an area that's already completely destroyed, and we can have an area that's super pristine, and your impact depends on that. So we can start measuring ecosystem intactness, and that could be changes from the original states in the ecological community. That could be change in number of species. There could be change in abundance. It could be change in the genetic diversity. It could be change in whatever we want to do, but it gives us a measurement of ecosystem intactness. So if we combine those two, we can do that at a global scale. We can look at where there's intact land, and you can always be upset by some of these colors, and we can always discuss whether it's done good, but you can map this out at a global scale, and you can map out integrity index. So if companies, and this is big if they know where they get the material on, they can go in and see what they're impacting. And these data we're getting down to at a global scale at a resolution of 20 by 25 kilometers. So they're slightly better than Brazil is an issue. And where do we get these data? We get them from space. This is what we're working with. We're not sending out enormous amount of That was the scientists being happy about the equipment going up to space. So for the last 10 years, we've had major programs in sending satellites up. It's a work between the European Union and NASA, and it's about getting equipment up to measure the condition on Earth at a very, very fine resolution. So if you know LiDAR that can go flies around and get the forest, we can do that from space now. The data is actually already arriving. We can start measuring productivity. We can start measuring change in soil. We don't need to go out there. We're doing a lot of ground truthing, and we're basically getting these are our field workers. These are the astronauts that's putting the equipment up there. And some of them is satellites, some of them is on the permanent space station. And basically is that we have equipment flying around that is now gathering the information. And we can convert that into information at a very, very fine resolution on Earth. This is an example that is not fully published yet, but this is looking at forest. We can go in from space and look at what is primary forest, what is secondary. We can even go in and look at the degree of destruction in the forest. We can look at what is planted, and there's of course some unclassified things, but we can start doing this. This is what I think most research group right now is jumping upon. The other thing is that we have a lot of knowledge about where biodiversity is, where the most important areas is, and where the hotspots are. But the other things we're now starting to combine is that we also know what the threat factors are, because some areas can be super impacted by logging, some by pollution, some by agriculture. There's different pressure on this. And at my center, with Jonas Geltman leading it, we are developing methods that if we have distribution data, we can start teasing apart what are the threat factors in a given area. Because in one area it could be logging, but for the same kind of organism in other areas, it's not logging, it's hunting. So there's differences in this. And all of this is starting to flowing into the scientific literature. So basically what I'm saying is that if we can solve the issue of where does our material come from, we can provide at a global scale a very fine resolution within the next couple of years, very simple estimates that is biological relevant. And we have the forest law in the EU that kind of put a pressure on you need to tell where the material is coming from. I would love to see that for gravel and other things. That's the direction. If that can be provided, we can provide simple index that actually can quantify in a meaningful manner the impact. My last slide, I mentioned this yesterday. I got called in this morning interview to the Danish news and saying that now we're going to have the first insect highway in Denmark. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, I thought, you're joking. I mean, you must be joking. No, this is seriously. So apparently the transport minister will help solve the Danish biodiversity crisis by planting, and you can see some very happy people here for the press photo, watering the plants we have along the highway, and then they say this is a positive contribution to it. But they didn't talk about the material, they didn't talk about where the highway was going, etc., etc. So the basic point here is, if we are to solve the biodiversity crisis, we need to take it seriously. I mean, this is not about planting and watering a little bit of plants. And as I said many times, Denmark is really fond of flower beds. We need to understand the biological realism, which I talked about yesterday, but we also need to measure impact and change. And I think we will be able to do that within just a couple of years. We will provide data from the scientific community to companies so they can actually do it. Thank you.